The main themes and topics of IR in the context of the TMW. Authority, the prince, in the TMW. Let us look at a few concrete aspects of the TMW as applied to classical topics studied by IR. A very important question in IR is the identification of the instance that will be the bearer of the supreme authority, determining the structure of the actor's behavior in the sphere of international relations. This instance is functionally called the bearer of sovereignty, or the prince, in the terminology of Machiavelli. The basic unit in the TMW is, as we saw, the civilization. Accordingly, it is necessary to identify how the problem of authority and its bearer, and hence the problem of sovereignty, is solved in this case. This question is not as simple as it might first appear. A civilization, as we saw, is a complex phenomenon, the mathematical and geometrical description of which demands the introduction of nonlinearity. This is a fundamental difference between the civilization and the nation-state, which was introduced in modernity as a rationalized, schematized reduction of reality, such as it is regarded in the majority of IR theories. Only post-positivist IR theories started to gradually relativize this linear picture, which dominates in realism and liberalism, and also with some significant modifications, in Marxism. The nonlinearity of processes and complexity of actors in turbulent models of postmodern international relations looks primitive, simple, and predictable in comparison to civilizations. Post-positivist theories have in any case as their conceptual limit the individual, hence the ideology of human rights, toward whose mathematical summation under all conditions the entire system of IR leads, even in the boldest postmodern models. The atomic individual is the conceptual basis of both nation-states and the postmodern alter-globalist multitudes. But in all cases this atomic individual is represented on the basis of Western anthropology and conceptualized in light of classic modern and postmodern ideas. In other words, the limit of the complexity of turbulent systems is the individual as a concept, constructed in accordance with the patterns of Western European sociology. Correspondingly, all calculations around the problems of the bearer of sovereignty are in one way or another built on the basis of this concept. Atoms can be combined in the most fantastical and ingenious manner, but any composition will always amount to a digital code, subject to statistical calculation. Thus, the question of authority and government in classical and even post-positivist IR theories can be reduced in principle to a calculational scheme. Individuals and groups of individuals can delegate authority to their representatives right up to a sovereign ruler, individual or collective, a president, prime minister, government, parliament, etc., or, by contrast, can move this authority lower and lower, to the middle, the subsidiarity of federal models, local self-government, or even lower. To the individual level, the project of the electronic referendum of all citizens through direct online participation in ultra-democratic utopias of planetary civil society. Whatever the instance of sovereignty, it is calculated and determined on the basis of the individual as a specifically Western basic sociological and anthropological concept. Authority is a human and individual phenomenon. But the pluralism of civilizations knocks the ground out from under such a conceptualization. The issue is that different civilizations operate with different anthropological constructs, the majority of which are not resolved into atomic individuals. In other words, atomic individuals are not irresolvable, atomic, or autonomously substantial elements. In different civilizations, man can be as you please, only not a self-dependent, self-identical unit. He is most often a conscious and explicit function of the social whole. This idea is the basis of the sociology of Durkheim and his followers, the cultural anthropology of Boas and his students, and also the structuralism of Levi Strauss. Accordingly, the structure of authority and its formalization in each distinct civilization reflects the specific organization of a holistic ensemble, which can differ significantly in each concrete case. The Hindu caste principle has little in common with Islamic religious democracy or Chinese ritualism. Moreover, the same civilizational bases can produce diverse conceptualizations of power in their relations to other societies and separate people. In Christian civilization we see at least two polar medieval models of the normative state: 1, the symphony of authorities and Caesaropapism of Byzantium, of which there are still echoes in Orthodox countries, especially in Russia, and 2, Augustinian, in the sense of the teaching of two cities, the principle of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, characteristic of the Catholic West. After the Reformation, a broad spectrum of Protestant conceptions of the nature of authority were added to this, from Lutheran monarchy to prophetic liberal Calvinism and eschatological Anabaptism. Hence, we should examine authority in the context of a civilization as a fractal, nonlinear phenomenon, reflecting the distinctive geometry of each concrete social hollows. Of course, someone in a civilization must decide questions concerning intercivilizational relations, concerning, in particular, war and peace, union and its dissolution, cooperation and exchange, prohibitions, quotas, tariffs, etc. We can call this the strategic pole of civilization. This instance is conditional and advanced purely theoretically as a conceptual space where the decisions are concentrated that touch to some extent the sphere of international relations. This strategic pole is the pole of the multipolar world, inasmuch as the world of civilizations is opened as multipolar precisely because of the intersection of interests or formulation of interests occurring through the instance of the pole. The strategic pole must be present in any civilization. Its presence makes the world multipolar, but its place and its content, and also its structure and ties with other levels of authority in each civilization can be unique and not resemble anything. An example of one such complex system is the model of decision-making in contemporary Iran, where the extent of sovereignty is shared proportionally between the secular authority of the president and the spiritual structures of the ayatollahs. In Saudi Arabia, the Majlis, an analogue of parliament, is a field for consensual decisions by the three powers dominating in that society, the large royal family, the spiritual authorities of Salaf Islam, and the members of the more significant Bedouin tribes. In contemporary China, the collection of political and economic interests of this singular country in its movement into the sphere of international relations is strictly controlled and regulated by the Communist Party. In India, the balance of front-end secular parliamentarism and an implicit caste system produces a multilevel model for important decision-making. In Russia, paternal authoritarianism, barely concealed by Western-style democratic procedures, is fully stable. All these real forms of the organization of the strategic pole are considered by Western measures anomalous, liable to Europeanization, Westernization, modernization, and democratization, and then abolition in a general system of global civil society. But today this project seems increasingly utopian, even to the most consistent apologists of planetary democracy. Significant in this regard is Fukuyama's change of opinion in recent years, as he recognized that his expectations for a quick end of history were clearly too hasty, since on the path to globalization and the creation of a planetary liberal democratic system there are too many difficult obstacles standing in the way of placing the end of history in the near future. In taking up the model of the multipolar world, systems of authority rooted in the civilizational peculiarities of traditional societies will lose the necessity of concealing themselves under superficially adopted and equivocal Western democratic standards. Thus, the strategic pole of civilization can announce itself fully openly, explicitly acknowledging itself as what it is implicitly in the majority of non-Western societies. But instead of feeling remorse for this before the unattainable model of the West, advanced as a universal norm, civilizations get the possibility of institutionalizing their own models of authority in accordance with their own traditions, the historical condition of their societies, and the will of the social figures, those exponents of the cultural hollows, who are considered the most authoritative and competent for such acts. This gives rise to the concept of our princeps nostrum, i.e. not simply a distinctive form of arranging the highest authority, autocracy, democracy, government, dynasty, meritocracy, etc., but also freedom to saturate it with diverse civilizational content, secular, sacred, functional, rational, or religious. The civilizational pluralism of the TMW does not at all insist on the abolition of democracy where it exists or on hindering its emergence and growth where it does not exist or is weak and nominal. Nothing of the sort. The TMW is not anti-democratic. But it is also not normatively democratic. Since many civilizations and societies do not at all consider democracy in its Western version a value or the optimal form of socio-political organization. If this is what a society thinks and if this has a foundation in the civilizational mode of life, it should be adopted as a fact. Supporters of democracy can fight for their ideals and opinions as much as they would like to. They can win, but they can also lose. These are all questions that should be decided within a civilization, without taking account of reproachful, encouraging, or dissatisfied external reactions. Thus, the strategic pole, which must exist because of the polycentric character of the multipolar world, cannot have a homogeneous political content, analogous to the concept of a nation-state in the Westphalian system. That system was based on optimistic confidence in the universality of human reason, by which was understood, as later became clear, the entirely specific rationality of the European human of the modern era, arrogantly and presumptuously taken as transcendental reason as such. The European rationality of the modern era, speedily eliminating itself today, proved to be a spatially local historical moment, nothing more. Postmodernism in general and the erosion of the Westphalian system in particular are connected with the gradual realization of this fact. The TMW does not propose a new universalism in the domain of determining who should be the normative bearer of authority in the new basic units of a multipolar world. But it also does not fall into the chaotic ecstasy of the semi-animal rhizomatic irrationalism of post-structuralists. Civilizations as structures, as languages, have every ground to develop their own original models of rationality, the hierarchical symmetry of which, predetermining the structure of relations among authorities, and consequently the political arrangement of society, which is nothing but the trace of a philosophical paradigm, as Plato and Aristotle clearly show, can be of any kind. So the question of authority in a multipolar world is answered as follows. From the outside, we mark in each civilization a strategic center, which acts as the subject of dialogue in international relations. This strategic center is the formalization of the civilization in its metonymic abbreviation in the system of multipolarity. But its structure and its content, its correlation with the internal layers and levels of society, the dimensions of its competence, and the character of its legitimacy, all this can vary qualitatively and fundamentally. Multipolarity forbids evaluating this legitimacy from without, i.e. making a judgment about the content of authority in a civilization other than the one to which the observer belongs. Thus, the concept of a strategic center remains fully concrete externally, in the sphere of international relations, but entirely arbitrary internally, and it can be configured in accordance with the cultural codes of each separate society on the basis of the social and political anthropology characteristic of it and it alone. We can call this principle of the TMW the plurality of the prince. Decision in the TMW. A similar fractal approach is a basic attitude of the TMW in relation to all other classic IR themes, connected with sovereignty, the legitimacy of actors, the legality of procedures in international relations, etc. In all cases, the correct answer will be appeal to the unique social and cultural character of each civilization, without any a priori projection. The TMW demands of the theoretician maximum civilizational apperception, i.e. the ability to reflect on his own belonging to the civilization from whose position he is carrying out the analysis of international relations, and penetration into the civilizational value system of the studied civilization. Fully relevant here is the demand made on cultural anthropologists who plan to study some archaic society. For this, the following are necessary. Knowledge of the language. Embedded observation. A moratorium on hasty conclusions and moral comparisons of the stranger with oneself. The absence of preconceived opinions and prejudices about the studied culture. the sincere intention to delve into how the members of a given society themselves understand and interpret their surrounding world, social institutions, traditions, symbols, rituals, etc. Boas and his students systematized and justified this perfectly. The TMW demands of the political scientist or international relations scholar skills of social and cultural anthropology, without which no conclusion regarding the political structures of some or another civilization and the correlations among these structures will have validity or scientific worth. Hence, questions relating to the problem of sovereignty, its bearers, and its structure demand preliminarily a deep comprehension of the civilizational field. As a convenient formula for the precise fixation of where concretely the strategic pole is located in a civilization, we can use the procedure proposed by Schmidt for determining sovereignty. Sovereign is he who decides in an exceptional situation, he asserted. An exceptional situation is a situation when the legal code, responsible for ordering questions of rule under normal circumstances, ceases to be in effect and cannot serve as a basis for choosing one or another course of action, involving significant groups of people and having broad social consequences. This definition by Schmidt is a convenient instrument for localizing the center of authority in problematic historical circumstances. If we use this criterion, then any decision made in an exceptional situation automatically means the localization of the pole of sovereignty. He who decides in exceptional circumstances is sovereign, even when he does not have enough legality or legitimacy from a legal perspective. And, on the contrary, he who does not decide in exceptional circumstances is not sovereign, even if he has formal legality and legitimacy. We thus get a concrete parameter for determining the location of the sovereign instance in practically any legal system, both where authority operates openly and transparently, potestas directa, and where it acts indirectly and secretly, potestas indirecta. So, in a civilization, given its natural indeterminacy and the complexity of the social layers within a general context, the position of the sovereign, the prince, is determined through the actual localization of the source of decisions made, and not vice versa. He who decides in exceptional circumstances is the prince, the bearer of sovereignty. This observation about decision allows us to treat a civilization as a system open to history and saturated with powerful existential energy. At some moment, any civilization in a multipolar world has to make a decision. And each time the channel of this decision can theoretically arise in a different segment of the civilization. This complicates extremely the structure of international law and makes it partly spontaneous and occasionalistic, ad hoc. But at the same time, it frees the natural element of historical being, full of inner power, potestas, from the necessity of constantly transgressing the system of legal norms, which becomes a limitation and constrains the current of vital, unpredictable history. Here, the concept of the chaos of international relations, present in classical paradigms, too, is entirely appropriate and relevant. The sphere of international relations in the context of the TMW is chaos to the extent that it allows decision to manifest at any point of a civilization, whether predictable or not. The challenging of decision and restraint of its elements, the formalization and legitimization of authority, all of this is an internal affair of each civilization. But theoretically we should examine sovereignty not as a legal postulate, but as a function of the very fact of the decision made in exceptional circumstances. In this case, the strategic poles of civilizations will constantly be dealing with a series of spontaneous challenges, and the drama of history will acquire a rich, organic, dynamic character in contrast to the routine, military, or pacifistic, into which international relations have transformed in the Westphalian era or under bipolarity, the doleful apogee of which is the weak-willed utopia of globalization. The point of decision-making in exceptional circumstances is the concretization of the historic spirit, not the dispersion of anatomical wishes and the simplest instincts, but movement along the vertical of intensive historical process. Elites and masses in the TMW. Practically the same thing can be said about the social stratification of civilizations and the distinction in them of higher and lower classes, elites, and masses, according to Pareto. The geometry of the social heights and social depths can vary in each civilization. The holism of non-Western civilizations can be caste, estate, theocratic, ethnic, monarchical, democratic, mixed anything. Theoretically, Western society can also become anything, although on the basis of empirical observation we can suppose that it will preserve into the future its individualistic and liberal democratic attitudes and tendencies and the dispersion of the social body toward atomization and civil society. And that is the West's full right to organize its society in accordance with its own will. Democratization and dispersion of authoritative powers, however, do not change the principal class inequality and the huge gap between the super-rich elite and all other citizens. So class inequality, which was industriously concealed in the 20th century by the growth of the middle class, which lately has slowed dramatically, constitutes for its part the elites and masses of the West in the sense of the hierarchies described in detail and criticized by Marxists. Elites and masses in the West are formed through class criteria. The West considers this normal and just, and other forms of hierarchization are rejected as inhumane, barbarous, and non-democratic. The West is fully justified in making any political decisions with respect to its own society. But in regard to non-Western societies in a multipolar world, the West loses its competence as a moral judge. People of the European culture of the modern era think that material inequality is just, and social inequality is not. Members of other civilizations, Hindu, for instance, have an entirely different opinion. The logic of Dharma and the laws of Artha lead the Hindu to a completely different kind of justice. It is just to follow traditions, including the caste tradition, and unjust to transgress them. The noble pauper who fulfills his karma is reincarnated in the higher world. The negligent rich man has every chance to be reincarnated as a pig. And this is just. But the invasion of Western criteria into the structure of traditional society is the height of injustice and a typically colonial and racist practice in its roots. It is unjust for Muslims for a bank to take a percentage, since time belongs to Allah, and money cannot beget money in time. This is blasphemy and sacrilege, infringement of the prerogative of the Lord of Worlds. At the same time, the stratification of Islamic society can seem unacceptable to Hindus, while Chinese Confucianists might see in Buddhism covert anarchy and asociality. Each civilization has elites and masses, upper and lower strata. And they have their functions in the social body in accordance with the normative configurations of this body. In some cases, they can influence foreign policy and act as competent groups, in contrast to the certainty among classical realists that the lambda individual, the member of the masses, has null competence in international questions. In other cases, they cannot, and then their share of influence in international relations is insignificant. But this question again depends on the case of the specific civilization under examination. Neither neoliberal concepts about the steadfast and guaranteed growth of the competence of the masses in international relations, nor realist skepticism on this account are applicable as a norm in the TMW. The social stratification of societies in a civilization is not an international problem, does not have a universal form, and is dealt with through the strategic center of civilization, however it might be constituted, as government, parliament, emperor, ruling party, the union of spiritual leaders, etc. The social body itself, the civilizational hollows, makes this center legitimate. Dialogue and the War of Civilizations. Now, let us outline how the TMW considers the problem of war in IR. War is a feature of human history, an event constantly encountered in it. Moreover, according to generally accepted conceptions, precisely war and revolution make history history. Practically all known states were created by wars or emerged in the course of military campaigns. Wars laid the basis for practically all historically existing elite groups. War, according to Heraclitus, is the father of all things. In some, it reveals gods; in others, people; in some, slaves; in others, free men. The polis as a state and politics as governance of the polis were always closely connected with the elements of war, internally, in regard to the main task of ensuring security, and from the perspective of military campaigns against an external enemy. To strive for an end of wars is the same as to strive for the abolishment of history or the disappearance of the human and human society. To minimize the risk of war or get rid of it altogether can be the task of certain cultures or social or gender types. Women are not inclined to the element of war and regard it most often as a catastrophe and purely negative phenomenon. But observation of the history of human societies shows that peace and war are cyclically alternating phenomena, replacing one another in a certain succession, however long or short the intervals might be. Consequently, the TMW does not preclude the possibility of war, conflict, between civilizations, but neither does it think that this is the sole possible scenario. Here we should turn to the concept of dialogue. Dialogue is in Greek conversation with someone else, where utterances are transmitted, dia from one to another. Dialogue can be expressed in words, but also in gestures. But words and gestures can be peaceful or aggressive, depending on the situation. Dialogue can be harsh. In the final analysis, war can also be a form of dialogue, during which one side communicates something to the other side in a harsh manner. Dialogue does not necessarily imply the equality of the speakers. The very structure of human language is hierarchical, so the pronunciation of phrases in a dialogue can full well bear the character of a deployment of the will to power or strategy of domination. This confirms again that war can also be regarded as a dialogue. In the TMW, there implicitly unfolds between civilizations precisely dialogue, which can be considered in two extremes, peaceful dialogue and non-peaceful dialogue. But in any case at issue is precisely communication, the intercourse of one with another, and, accordingly, the socialization of a civilization or several civilizations at once in the general system of international relations. Civilizations are constantly in dialogue with each other. Sometimes the dialogues last millennia, during which peoples, cultures, and religions mix, intersect, come closer to one another, absorb one another, separate and move away from one another, etc. Hence, it is not possible to begin a dialogue between civilizations and it is not possible to end it. It goes on by itself, and all human history can be regarded as an uninterruptedly continuing dialogue. But civilizations become the main actors of international relations only under certain circumstances. According to the TMW, today we are living in precisely such a situation, and so the structure of the dialogue of civilizations demands a new comprehension and heightened reflection. Precisely today, this dialogue needs formalization. How, about what, and to what end do civilizations dialogue with each other? The dialogue of civilizations is the constitution of the basic pair of identities we and they, which is an integral part of any society. Society can recognize itself as itself only before a different society apprehended as an other. Since a civilization is a maximally complex system of society, consisting, in the first place, of both hierarchical and juxtaposed layers and strata, the degree of this civilizational reflectiveness about its own identity requires special instruments, much more complex than the models and procedures of identification for other basic units. Civilizational identity, both for self-assertion and for opposing itself to another, and, accordingly, for forming the figure of the other, demands the highest extent of complex reflection. As a rule, this level is expressed in a particular philosophy or theology, a spiritual tradition, concentrated in the intellectual elite, but tangentially touching all social strata, right to its very depths. That which is the philosophy or theology for the elites becomes the typical look of the mentality, psychology, and average cultural type for the masses. But on every level, from the keen awareness of philosophical foundations to the most inertial and unconscious mental and psychological clichés, through historical events, political reforms, progress in the arts and sciences and in economic practices, the identity of a civilization is asserted, and in being asserted as such necessarily contrasts with the identity of other, neighboring civilizations. This is the dialogue of civilizations, the constant comparison of one's own and the foreign, the discovery of common characteristics or, by contrast, differences, the exchange of separate elements and rejection of others, the disclosure of meanings or semantic shifts that distort the elements of another civilization. In certain cases, the presence of the other becomes the basis for wars. In others, dialogue develops peacefully and constructively. Civilizations dialogue with one another about the constantly redefined balance of mine and thine, identity and otherness. This dialogue has no final goal, since it does not set before itself the task of convincing the other of one's rightfulness or, the more so, in adopting the figure of the other as normative for oneself, also in some cases of extreme expansion or extreme passivity, this, too, can happen. But the purpose is not the attainment of a goal, but rather the dialogue itself, which in the open historical process always shrouds itself in a sequence of historical events arising in various spheres, from religious and political reforms and the appearance of new philosophical theories to popular uprisings, dynastic overthrows, military campaigns, cycles of economic growth and decline, new discoveries, expansions and contractions, ethnic migrations, etc. The whole multilevel structure of civilization participates in the dialogue, and it is carried on throughout all its stages. However, the dialogue is formalized by the intellectual elite, who are able capaciously to reflect and determine the parameters of their own identity and the identity of the other. To a significant extent, they configure the figure of the other, ascribe to it these or those traits, correctly or incorrectly surmise the semantic blocks of the civilization with whom they are in dialogue. In increasing the level of a civilization's formalization, the role of the intellectual elite also grows substantially, since it becomes the bearer of the dialogue of civilizations not merely by inertia, but according to its own function. And this function acquires a highly important international dimension, since the very structure of international relations in a multipolar world depends directly on the structure of the dialogue of civilizations. If the strategic pole is the place of making decisions and the point of the civilization's sovereignty, the substantial, semantic center of a civilization is concentrated in its intellectual elite, which under multipolarity sharply increases its status in the domain of international life. This elite is empowered to saturate multipolarity with semantic content and to unfold substantial processes constitutive for the sphere of international relations, and, consequently, for the history of humanity. In the dialogue of civilizations, the intellectual elite should execute a discount of all the major factors, economic, technological, material, resource, logistical, etc. Sign, image, concept, philosophical theory, and theological exegesis represent the main synthetic message from one civilization to another. And the curve of world history, war or peace, conflict or cooperation, collapse or ascension, will largely depend on what this message will be in each case. The dialogue at issue cannot be reduced to competition, to the establishment of hegemonic relations, to convincing others of one's rightfulness, etc. The dialogue of civilizations is an irreducible, fractal field of free and spontaneous history, not programmed, and unpredictable, since the future in this case is considered a constituted horizon of thought and will. Thought concerns the area of competence of the civilization's intellectual elite, will, the strategic pole and the point of decision. Together, these two principles comprise the hologram of the civilization, its living, symbolic mediastinum, the solar plexus of the civilizational nervous system. Neither authority, nor economy, nor material resources, nor competition, nor security, nor interests, nor comfort, nor survival, nor pride, nor aggression is the basic motivation of the historical being of civilizations in a multipolar world, but precisely the process of spiritual dialogue, which can on any bend or under any circumstances acquire a positive and peaceful or aggressive and martial character. Spiritual battles, as Rimbaud wrote in A Season in Hell, are as brutal as the battles of men. It is obvious that contemporary Western civilization is tired of history and no longer inspired by the high horizons of its freedom. Hence, the aspiration to be done with it as quickly as possible, to close the historical process. But the specific character of the TMW consists precisely in opening and winning back the possibility of looking at the world, at time and the era, not only with the eyes of the West, but this means that the dialogue of civilizations is conceived of not as something mechanical, routine, and having the sole goal of no more war, but as something saturated, alive, unpredictable, tense, substantial, risky, and with an open and unknown finale. Diplomacy, Anthropology and Traditionalism. Classical theories of IR distinguish a special group of authorized persons occupied with planning and conducting the foreign policy of the state, the diplomatic community. Its significance in international relations is great, since the entire structure of international relations depends to a significant extent on the competence and effectiveness of diplomats. Diplomats do not determine foreign policy. This decision is located as a rule on the level of the head of state or another executive organ. But the diplomatic community transforms the decision into reality, and quite a lot in international relations often depends on how artfully the diplomat does this. So, in the Westphalian system, the occupation of diplomat requires special preparation, familiarity with diverse standards and national psychology, certain skills in the conduct and manner of negotiation. Most often, diplomats are the social elite and are recruited from the highest strata. Multipolarity makes some additional demands of the diplomatic community. Intercivilizational relations amount to dialogue. And in times of peace this dialogue acquires its highest formulation in the acts of precisely the diplomatic community that represents one civilization to another. Thus, diplomacy in the context of the TMW acquires a qualitatively new dimension. It is entrusted with the mission of the skillful conduct of intercivilizational dialogue. We saw earlier that in the TMW, the civilization's intellectual elite is responsible for this dialogue. Accordingly, the diplomatic community should be an integral part of this elite. Belonging to the intellectual elite implies a deep extent of reflection concerning the identity of one's civilization, including its multidimensional and diverse layers and nonlinearities. So a member of the intellectual elite should by definition be distinguished by his remarkable skills in the domain of philosophy, and/or theology. This demand is fully made of diplomats, too. But at the same time, another important competence is required of diplomats who act in the name of a civilization, the ability to understand the structure of the other civilization, with which the given one is in dialogue, and hence to master or create anew a correct system of translation, even approximately, of meaning of one civilization in the context of another. Besides reflecting on his own identity, the diplomat of a multipolar world should be able to embrace another identity, to penetrate into it to a depth critically important for mutual understanding. This requires possession of a certain topos that could be approximately common to the most diverse civilizational contexts. In this connection, we should immediately reject Western hegemonism, which claims universal explanation of the main attitudes about society, politics, and the world, on the basis of the criteria and norms of Western civilization itself. The Western versions of the humanitarian disciplines, philosophy, history, sociology, law, political science, cultural studies, etc., are shot through with ethnocentrism and striving for epistemological hegemony. So reliance on this basis takes us out of the context of multipolarity, and in the apparent convenience of appealing to the systematization of culture and philosophy worked out by the West, this simple path proves to be the longest and leads nowhere, i.e. is unacceptable. It should be rejected as obviously unfit for the formation of a diplomatic community in a multipolar world. Only on the periphery of Western science and philosophy can we find certain methods and theories that might provide important conceptual support for the education of the professional participants of the dialogue of civilizations. In the first place, we find cultural and social anthropology, whose members elaborated a method of study of archaic societies, setting before themselves the goal of ridding themselves of the projection of West-centric theories onto the social object of study. Anthropologists developed a system of rules that allows them to get as close as possible to the life world of non-Western societies, to clarify the structure of those societies' symbolic and mythological ideas, and to sort out complex taxonomies that do not lie on the surface, and often contrast sharply with the systematizations customary to someone from the West. At the same time, within the context of Western science, the anthropological methods are applied almost exclusively to illiterate cultures, leaving the analysis of more complex societies, civilizations, to the classical disciplines, philosophy, history, sociology, religious studies, etc. In the context of a multipolar world, the anthropological approach can be successfully applied to the study of civilizations. And if we strictly follow the rules of cultural anthropology, there is a chance to obtain specialists and intellectuals who really do not depend on the epistemological hegemony of the West, and who are at the same time able to reach the deep civilization codes differing from their own and to deconstruct the identities and complexes of identity characteristic of them. Diplomacy in the TMW should be firmly attached to anthropology, and diplomatic competences should be based on the skillful possession of the basic habits of anthropological praxis. A second way of systematizing intercivilizational diplomacy in a multipolar world is traditionalist philosophy. The majority of civilizations existing today are varieties of traditional societies with a relatively low extent of modernization. In traditional society, religion, the sacred, symbol, ritual, and myth play, as is well known, a decisive role. Different religions are based on their own original theological complexes, which are either irreducible to others or are reducible, but with a huge amount of detail covering the initial meaning. Efforts to build syncretic models to facilitate interconfessional dialogue will not come to anything, since they will quickly come up against opposition of the conservative orthodoxy and will only provoke a wave of protest in the civilizations themselves. So neither a secular, Western, basis nor religious syncretism can serve as the foundation for diplomatic practice in the domain of interconfessional relations, to which important aspects of the dialogue of civilizations will come to a significant extent. In this situation, there is only one solution: to take as the foundation the philosophy of traditionalism, Guénon, Evola, Iliad, etc., which represents the project of clarifying the semantic map common to traditional society as such, especially in its opposition to the secular, Western society of the modern era. But this secular society of the West, too, is analyzed by traditionalists from the perspective of traditional society, which makes this an optimal method for the majority of civilizations. A full-fledged and semantically correct dialogue between civilizations can be built only on the basis of traditionalist philosophy. After distinguishing the main directions of multipolar diplomacy, we get a theoretical basis for its establishment. Other requirements: familiarity with the technological conditions of another civilization, with military, technical, and strategic aspects, demography, ecology, social and material problems, etc., are naturally part of the necessary training for professional diplomats. But the dialogue of civilizations requires first of all the establishment of a channel for the correct transmission of meanings. Without this channel, the entire complex of technical knowledge will be deprived of its solid base and will become useless and perverted knowledge. Not questions of war and peace, trade or blockade, migration or security should stand at the head of multipolar diplomacy, but rather questions of the meaning of philosophy, the circulation of ideas, in the Platonic sense. Thus, diplomacy should be transformed into a kind of sacred profession. Economy in the TMW. By the rules of contemporary discourse, no theory and no project can do without an economic program and the calculations and computations corresponding to it. The question naturally arises, on what economic model will the multipolar world be based? In the case of a unipolar or global world, we are dealing with a single answer: the contemporary model of economics is a capitalist system, and in the future all projects will be built on this basis. At the same time, it is practically an axiom that capitalism has entered its third phase of development, post-industrial economy, information society, economy of knowledge, turbo-capitalism, according to Lutwak, etc., characterized by the significant dominance of the financial sector over the industrial and agricultural sectors. Disproportionate growth of the specific weight of the stock market, hedge funds, and other purely financial institutions. High market volatility. The development of transnational networks. The absorption by the third sector, service sector, of the second, manufacturing, and first, agricultural. Delocalization of industry from the countries of the rich north to the countries of the poor south. Global division of labor and growth in influence of transnational corporations. Sharp increase in high technology, high precision and information technology. Increase in the significance of virtual space for the development of economic and financial processes, electronic exchanges, etc. This is a picture of the global economy in the present and, if things will continue by inertia, the near future. However, such an economic model is not compatible with multipolarity, since at its basis lies the implementation of Western codes of conduct of the economy on a global scale, the homogenization of the economic practices of all societies, the abolition of civilizational differences, and hence the reduction of all civilizations into a cosmopolitan system acting in accordance with universal rules and protocols first formed and applied by the capitalist West in its own interests. The contemporary global economy is a hegemonic phenomenon. Neo-Marxists in IR describe this compellingly, but it is also admitted by realists and liberals. Post-positivist theories, critical theory and postmodernism, are largely directed against this hegemony. The preservation of this economic system is incompatible with the realization of the multipolar project. So the TMW must have recourse to alternative economic theories. It is useful in this regard to closely examine the Marxist and neo-Marxist critique of the capitalist system and their analysis of its fundamental contradictions, as well as the clarification and prediction of the nature of inevitable crises. Marxists often speak of the systematic failure of capitalism and see its manifestations in the waves of the economic crises that shook humanity starting in 2008 after the collapse of the American mortgage system. Although Marxists themselves think that the financial crisis of capitalism will happen only after the final internationalization of the world system and the two global classes, the global bourgeoisie and the global proletariat, their interpretation of crises and prediction of their intensification is entirely realistic. In contrast to Marxists, supporters of the TMW should not put multipolarity aside until the period that follows globalization. It is entirely possible that the near-term crises will bring a fatal blow against the capitalist system, without waiting for the completion of globalization and the cosmopolitization of classes. This can well lead to a full-scale Third World War. But in any case, the global economic model that exists today will in the nearest future most likely suffer a fundamental and irreversible crisis. And it will probably stop existing, at least in its present form. The most recent borders of expansion of the new economy and post-industrial order are apparent today, and it is not difficult to notice that in a few steps the system will collapse. What can the TMW oppose to post-industrialism in the economic sphere? Our points of reference should be the overthrow of the capitalist hegemony of the West, rejection of the pretensions of the liberal economy and market model to universalism and globally self-evident normativity and, consequently, economic pluralism. The multipolar economy should be based on the principle of different poles in the economic map of the world. 2. The prospects of economic alternatives should be sought in the field of philosophy, which rejects or at least relativizes the significance of the material, hedonistic factor. Acknowledgement of the material world as the sole, most important thing, and material success as the highest social, cultural, and spiritual value inevitably leads us to capitalism and liberalism, i.e. to agreement with the rightfulness of the economic hegemony of the West. Even if non-Western countries will want to turn economic processes to their favor and underline the West's monopoly on control in the domain of the market economy globally, sooner or later the logic of capital will impose on non-Western countries and civilizations all the norms that exist today. Marxists are right about this. Capital has its own logic, and once it is accepted, it leads the social and political system to a bourgeois form, identical to the Western one. So to act against the hegemony of the rich North and to express loyalty to the capitalist system is a total contradiction and a fundamental conceptual barrier on the path to the establishment of true multipolarity. The American sociologist Sorokin clearly saw the limits of the materialistic Western civilization. From his perspective, an economy-centric society based on hedonism, individualism, consumerism, and comfort, is doomed to quick disappearance. It will be replaced by an ideational society, which has as its cornerstone radically spiritual and sometimes anti-material values. This prognosis can be a guiding thread for the TMW in its relation to economics generally. If we see in multipolarity precisely tomorrow's day, and not a mere continuation of today, we must follow the intuition of this outstanding sociologist. The American sociologist Sorokin clearly saw the limits of the materialistic Western civilization. From his perspective, an economy-centric society based on hedonism, individualism, consumerism, and comfort, is doomed to quick disappearance. It will be replaced by an ideational society, which has as its cornerstone radically spiritual and sometimes anti-material values. This prognosis can be a guiding thread for the TMW in its relation to economics generally. If we see in multipolarity precisely tomorrow's day, and not a mere continuation of today, we must follow the intuition of this outstanding sociologist. Today, the majority of Western and non-Western economists are convinced that there is no alternative to the market economy. Such confidence is equivalent to confidence that all societies are moved by inclination toward material comfort and consumerism, and, consequently, that there can be no multipolarity. If we admit that economics is fate, we automatically admit that the liberal economy is fate, and in this case the economic hegemony of the rich North becomes natural, justified, and legitimate. It only remains for other countries to develop quickly, which will bring the world system to globalization, class stratification, and the abolition of the borders of civilizations. Here, Wallerstein is entirely correct. From here the logical conclusion follows that the economic model of the multipolar world should be built on the rejection of economy centrism and on setting economic factors below social, cultural, religious, and political factors. Not material, but the idea is fate, and, consequently, economics should not dictate what to do in the political sphere, but the political sphere should dominate over economic motivations and structures. Without the relativization of economics, without subordinating the material to the spiritual, without transforming the economic sphere into a subordinate and secondary dimension of civilization as such, multipolarity is unattainable. Consequently, the TMW should reject all types of economy-centric conceptions, both liberal and Marxist, since in Marxism the economy is also thought of as historical fate. Anti-capitalism, and especially anti-liberalism, should become the guiding vectors of the establishment of a TMW. We can take as positive reference points the spectrum of alternative concepts that until today remain marginal among classical economic theories, for entirely understandable hegemonic reasons. As a first step in the destruction of the global economic system as it is today, we should probably turn to List's theory of the autarky of large spaces, which proposes the creation of closed economic zones on territories belonging to a shared civilization. 28 The theory suggests erecting trade barriers along the perimeter of these territories, which are formed to stimulate, within the limits of the civilization, production of the necessary minimum of goods and services required for the satisfaction of the population's needs and the development of the domestic production. Potential. External trade between large spaces is preserved, but is organized so that no one large space becomes dependent on foreign supplies. This guarantees the restructuring of the entire economic system in each civilization in accordance with regional particularities and the needs of the internal market. Since civilization is by definition a demographically weighty area, having an internal market will be enough for intensive development. At the same time, we should immediately raise the question of the creation of systems of regional currencies and rejection of the dollar as the global reserve currency. Each civilization should issue its own independent currency, secured by the economic potential of a given large space. The polycentrism of currencies will thus become a direct expression of economic multipolarity. We should also reject any kind of universal standard in intercivilizational settlements. The course of currencies should be determined by the qualitative structure of the external trade among two or more civilizations. The cornerstone should be the real economy, corresponding to the volume of concrete goods and services. Acceptance of these rules will create the preconditions for further diversification of the economic models of each civilization. Leaving the space of global liberal capitalism and organizing large spaces in accordance with civilizational peculiarities, still on a market level, civilizations will further be able to elaborate their economic models themselves, according to cultural and historical traditions. In Islamic civilization, there will probably be a moratorium on bank interest. In other civilizations, there might be a turn towards socialistic practices of redistribution through some model or other, through management of the tax system, according to the theory of the French economist Sismondi, or through other instruments, right up to the introduction of a planned economy and dirigist methods. Point 29. The economic pluralism of civilizations should be established gradually, without any universal instructions. Different societies will be able to create different economic models, whether market, mixed, or planned, on the basis of either the economic practices of traditional society or new post-industrial technologies. The most important thing is to demolish liberal dogmatism and the hegemony of capitalistic orthodoxy, and to undermine the global function of the rich North as the main beneficiary in the organization of the planetary division of labor. The division of labor should develop only within large spaces, or else a civilization will prove dependent on another, which risks engendering new hegemonies. Media in the TMW. Mass media plays a huge role in the contemporary structure of international relations. It creates a single planetary informational environment, which more and more influences international processes. Media becomes global, and through media discourse facilitates the processes of globalization, in the interests of the West. The global mass media is an extremely important instrument for the West in forming social opinion and is essentially an instrument of global rule. To build a multipolar world, it is necessary to start a frontal attack against the globalistic mass media. The role of the mass media in a traditional society is very limited. Its growth of influence is directly connected with modernity, bourgeois democracy, and civil society. The mass media is a constitutive element of democracy and claims to embody an additional dimension, between the authorities and society, elites, and masses. In the space of mediocracy, a new model normative type is formed, which influences the masses as a veiled injunction instituting the special ontology of democratic society. What the media mentions exists, what it does not mention does not exist. For the authorities, mass media substitutes for social opinion, i.e., it is a surrogate of the masses. Thus, the space of mass media should in theory remove the tension between the heights and depths of society, translating their hierarchical relations into the horizontal flatness of the television screen, the newspaper, the computer, the pad, the mobile telephone, etc. Media space is a double simulacrum, a simulacrum of authority and a simulacrum of society. Globalization spreads this principle to all humanity, transforming it into a global simulacrum. In mass media we encounter the projected reality of global government and the idea of an analogously projected, from below, reality of planetary society. This gives rise to a certain virtual world, which embodies in itself a global hegemonic construct projected by capital and the West. The independence of the mass media. from nation-states makes it a privileged area for dissipative postmodern structures. Hence, in this domain the transition from modernity to postmodernity is most apparent, and virtuality replaces reality most perceptibly. The global mass media creates models in non-Western countries for the national mass media, arranging them under the general virtual project. And as the role of mass media grows, the structures of traditional society prove either to be in a blind spot or are subject to planned and systematic attacks, meant to weaken and smear them. In its nature, mass media is bourgeois and bears the mark of Western culture. So for the construction of a TMW, it is necessary to seriously reconsider its role in society. We can identify two stages on this path. The first stage consists of creating a network of civilizational mass media, which would serve as the constant mouthpiece of integrational processes and would facilitate the consolidation of civilizational identity. In this case, the civilizational mass media could undermine the monopoly of the global, and hence subject to the interests of the West, mass media and create the preconditions for the consolidation of cultural and social groups around the axis of a common civilization. The second phase will consist in returning mass media into the context of the structure of the society that will be built on a civilizational basis, taking into account the particular cultural code. We cannot exclude the possibility that in some civilizations the phenomenon of mass media will be abolished, since no universal norms concerning this question will remain, and the decision about how to organize relations between the authorities and society, elites, and masses, will be decided on the basis of free civilizational quest. Some civilizations might keep the space of democratic simulacra and the virtual doubling of reality, while others might well prefer to refuse it. Summary. The following table summarizes the content that the main themes of concepts of IR receive in the TMW, see below. Our theoretical propositions constitute a prolegomenon to a full-fledged TMW. The task in this chapter was to clarify the content of the concept of multipolarity, to relate the TMW to the existing theories of IR, and to begin to formulate some of the basic principles of this theory. Our analysis can be looked at as preparing the ground for the full construction of a developed TMW. We have on the whole marked out the main paths of this development. But a detailed elaboration of these directions is a matter for the future and still awaits execution. The pluralism contained in the very foundation of the multipolar approach excludes any form of dogmatism. It is useless to argue about the details of the multipolar order, the rate of establishing this order, the localization of borders between civilizations, and the nuances of the legal formulation of the new system of international relations. Even the precise number of actors in the multipolar world remains an open question for now. It was fundamental to make a theoretical break, away from the utterly vague and indefinite use of the term multipolarity, multipolar world, toward the theoretical basis, in light of which it acquires a fully concrete. Though open for further consideration, content. Themes. Sub-themes. TMW actors quantity several poles subjects civilizations political institutionalization. Politeia structure plural. Geopolitics main geopolitical concept. Large spaces. Borders poles/zones frontiers environment global institution non-international relations structure anarchy among civilizations. Hegemony regional hegemony commonwealth. The prince. Authority or prince/princeps nostrum. Hierarchy, content depends on civilization. Sovereignty of politeia. Decision competence of the prince on the basis of tradition war possibility open. Peace intracivilizational. Pax nostrum security civilizational security interests civilizational interests values civilizational values. Power spiritual/material. Qualitatively plural, depends on the civilization, international political economy. Paradigm plural paradigm/autarky of large spaces division of labor intracivilizational mass media structure civilizational significance secondary.